these countries. Donald Trump's crazy for trying to do it. So I think Joe Biden said he's going to leave troops in the Middle East. And this is where we're at on it. But let's move on and talk about some news stories. I got one here that you have. I think you actually wrote up at RT, Will.
Yeah.
So tell us all about it.
Yeah, sure. So the people who are watching, they can see the headline on there: Pentagon awards Northrop Grumman contract to develop next-gen $85 billion ICBM. And this is to upgrade the what they call the nuclear triad. There's actually been, right now, the U.S. military is in the middle of this huge long-term nuclear modernization project, which I think was actually launched right at the end of the Obama administration. And this is supposed to cost us, it's supposed to run for 30 years. It's a 30-year project that's supposed to cost over $1 trillion. And so this is a massive thing they've embarked on. And Trump, of course, has done very little, nothing to reverse any of that. In fact, he's fully embraced that whole project. He keeps approving all these bigger budgets for nuclear upgrades, even higher than what the projections were under the Obama administration. So the most recent development here, though, came on Tuesday when, and that's what I've written the story about here, when the Air Force formally granted this huge $13.3 billion contract to Northrop Grumman to develop the new intercontinental ballistic missile, which is supposed to replace what they call the Minuteman III missile. And the Minuteman III is those have been in service since 1970. They've been upgraded since then, of course, but they're fairly outdated weapons. And so now they're going to try to create a whole new missile from scratch to replace all 450 Minuteman IIIs, which right now I think are spread out between 3 bases in the U.S. that we have all of these ICBMs there. And right now the Minuteman is actually our only land-based ICBM. So they're looking to replace those with something more modern, I guess. And the new thing they're working on, they call the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent, or GBSD. I'm sure they'll give it a cooler name once they're done with it. That's just the placeholder name right now. But I think a lot of our listeners are probably aware of this, but just maybe for those who are catching up or who don't know, this type of ICBM is 1/3 of what's called the nuclear triad, where the idea is they want to have nuclear weapons on land, in the air, and at sea. And so in practice, that means having these land-based ICBMs like the Minuteman IIIs and the ground-based strategic deterrents we're developing. But that also means having nuclear-capable submarines, as well as long-range strategic bombers, like aircraft. And that's the idea there is it's supposed to make sure that nobody can wipe out all of our nukes in a first strike, that it reinforces mutually assured destruction, because no matter what, we'll always be able to strike back. So that will make people think twice about, striking us. And so that's what they're upgrading right now. They're currently upgrading the whole triad. And that's why this is a 30-year, $1 trillion project. And they've actually already started on developing the B-21 radar bomber, a long-range bomber, and the new Columbia-class submarines, which will be nuclear capable. And so the latest thing here is this ICBM that they're giving to Northrop Grumman. And this is just the first stage of that whole thing. Like the headline of my story said, the ICBM is supposed to cost $85 billion throughout its whole life, when all is said and done. But Northrop Grumman has been given the first stage of that contract to start developing and designing this new missile. And Northrop, they're not quite as big as Lockheed. Lockheed's the biggest, but they are in the top 5. And it wasn't actually that surprising they got this contract either. They were the sole bidder left on the Air Force bidding thing. Boeing was supposed to, they were also in the running for a while, but they dropped out last year. There was this big complicated dispute over acquiring the motors for the ICBM, and they eventually just gave up and dropped out. So yeah, Northrop has now been contract. And I think this is kind of funny because we were just talking about Trump, him talking about the military brass and how they're always serving the arms dealers. And this nuclear modernization project that he seems to love so much is doing just that. It's serving, it's shoveling, like I said, $1 trillion to these arms manufacturers, because that's who's going to be getting the lion's share of that money when they're, developing these new weapons.
Right. Well, I as you're saying that, I'm just thinking, I wish I had kept that clip from the last episode of the show when Trump was like, we give too much money to the military contractors. It seems like this could very much be a critique at, Trump could be critiquing Trump's China policy here, where he's only acted so aggressively towards China to give us a, excuse to maintain our nuclear triad, which is really outdated. Something that, has been pointed out by the likes of somebody like Ron Paul is that really you just need the submarine launched nuclear missiles to maintain your nuclear deterrent. You're able to hide them well enough, and They could essentially be anywhere, and so those are the real deterrents. In fact, that's why one of the reasons they're so worried about North Korea having a submarine launch ballistic missile is because they put eventually a nuclear weapon on it, and then you have no idea where their submarines are, so you don't know. You can't carry out first strike against them because they can always retaliate with their nukes on their submarine. And in fact, as far as the nuclear triad goes, there's a lot of people that say, hey, you don't even need the ground based ones anymore. The strategic bombers are the other things that, again, they can move around, so they're not just sitting there. In fact, the nuclear missiles are sometimes referred to as the nuclear sponge. Essentially, the U.S. wants to have enough like ground-based nuclear weapons that the Soviets would have to use a bunch of their nukes to take out our ground-based nukes. And so, we have this area that's sparsely populated, Montana, Wyoming, all this like kind of mountain Great Plains area that they feel like if they put their ballistic missiles there, then they're the Soviet or not the Soviets, the Russians, I guess initially was planned for the Soviets, would
Yeah.
or the Chinese now would have to waste all their nukes going after our ground-based nukes, giving us more availability to, I guess, bomb their cities. Of course, I mean, from my perspective, if you drop 15 nukes on Montana, what's the point if New York City gets a nuclear bomb or not? Everybody there is gonna end up dying.
Right, right.
So yeah, the nuclear sponge thing is silly. Also, I mean, you would think that people in these states would be. I mean, I'm eventually going to live in like a mountain state. I don't know how close the nearest nuclear sponge is to
You're gonna be in the sponge, dude.
Denver, but yeah, that it's really upsetting that like what my life isn't worth what a life in New York City is. Hell, if anything, nuclear New York City should be our nuclear sponge. But
Yeah, what about Washington D.C.?
yeah, so we don't need to be wasting this money here. One thing I was thinking about, Will, is like even if they like took like this and divided it into, let's say, like 10,000 pieces, and distribute what that would be like $133,000 to 10,000 people. Like, who wouldn't raise their hand and be like, yes, that is a life changing amount of money if I get that?
Right.
It's just insane what we waste this money on. And of course, it's gonna mostly go to like people who are already extremely wealthy. This isn't going